Glennon Doyle Melton is a mother, a recovering addict, a beautifully vulnerable and honest writer, and a Sunday school teacher. One Sunday, she waited for her class to fill with little ones. She waited for them to file into the sanctuary of her church. She describes her experience watching all these kids eager to learn about Jesus come into the sanctuary that day as her heart swelling in her chest. In fact, she says that has to be how the Grinch felt when his heart grew in his chest, almost jumping out of his body. Well, that day, she made eye contact with a little boy that was new to the class. He wore a name tag that read Ryan. After dancing and singing and sharing the lesson together, they leave moments of quiet. It was during these still moments that she made eye contact with Ryan once again. He tentatively waved her over to him, but she could tell by his face that he didn't want her to draw any attention to him. So she quietly made her way over to him and sat down beside him, making sure to look forward the whole time as to not draw any unneeded attention. After a little while, Ryan tapped her on the shoulder. She looked over to him. He leaned in and whispered in her ear, "Excuse me, is God coming?" Glennon writes, "Then Ryan looked around again like he was expecting God to show up here, like Ronald sometimes occasionally shows up at McDonald's, and they just stared at this little man who had just asked me the question every single human being who has ever looked around a fancy sanctuary, or a busted up family, or a hurting friendship, or a shocking diagnosis, or a messy world is thinking. Excuse me, is God coming?" Might that be how the two disciples we heard about today felt? We find the opening to our gospel story for today taking place on a road between Jerusalem and Emmaus. It's just a couple of days after Jesus has been violently crucified by the authorities of the Roman Empire. We meet these two disciples traveling this road together. The road should be the same as it has always been, but this time it's different. It's filled with grief and sorrow and dashed hopes and broken dreams. I wonder if you have traveled this road too. I know I have. Might one look to the other and say, "Excuse me, is God coming?" Or might they be wondering, is God going to show up? The women had said the tomb was empty, but could they really believe these women? And how could a dead body, Jesus' dead body, just be gone? After all, this was not the ending they had hoped for. Luke tells us the two disciples are walking and discussing all the events that have taken place over the last days, rehashing all these events to figure out just how they'd gotten to this place. This place that I imagine to be full of grief and disappointment. Perhaps they're just trying to find their way back to a new normal. But they do have each other as they walk this road. How helpful to have another person walk by your side and walk with you in your grief and your disappointment. And then another man joins them. Now, we know who this man is, but the disciples sure don't. Not yet, anyway. God in Jesus comes to them. Jesus shows up on that road with them. And they engage in conversation about the things that have happened. Jesus recounts all the things about the Messiah in the scriptures, and then just as they are reaching Emmaus, Jesus seems to be ready to leave from the disciples' company. Something urges them to invite him in to stay with them, even though it's last minute, because after all, it is almost evening. They sit down around the table together for a meal. They pause after the long journey of the day, of the past days. They pause amidst all their grief, doubt, unrealized hopes, and disappointments to share a meal together. In a simple but life-changing, eye-opening act, Jesus took bread, blessed it, broke it, and gave it to them. And those disciples can see that it was Jesus who was with them the whole time. Excuse me, is God coming? Ryan's innocent question lingers in the air. It's a question I have asked many times. Perhaps you have too. Excuse me, God, when are you going to show up? When are you going to show up in this mess of a world we live in that is literally torn apart, divided by racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia, xenophobia, in a world torn apart by greed, anger, and violence? When are you going to show up in my life? When are you going to show up amongst the pain, grief, fear of the unknown, the disappointment, and in the midst of hopes left lingering? Excuse me, God, when are you going to show up? Are you coming to meet us? Jesus revealed himself to the disciples in the breaking of the bread that day in Emmaus. And Jesus revealed himself to Glennon and Ryan that day in a Sunday school class. Glennon went on to tell Ryan his question was so important that it needed to be shared with the whole class. He gave his permission, and so Glennon attempted to provide an answer to this 5-year-old's question. She said something along the lines of, "My hunch is that God is already here with us because God is in you and in me and in all of us. And when we show up to be together, we bring God to each other. My hunch is that God sent us to be here for each other because we are all God's family. And sometimes family members send each other. You know how sometimes your daddy sends your mommy to pick you up and sometimes your mommy sends your daddy?" Now, while most of the kids nodded in agreement, Ryan was still and silent. Then he said, "My daddy doesn't pick me up. My daddy's in heaven." Everyone was silent. Glennon held this holy silence for a bit and then prayed that God would give her the words to be what this little boy needed. She told this boy of God's unfathomable love for him and said her guess was that his daddy was with God and God sent all his new friends and teachers to be with him today. She says, God sends us places to meet God in others and to be a glimpse of God's love for others. Then she said, "Ryan, I don't know how you can know it for sure if God is here or not. But here's what happens to me when I notice that God is with me. My heart starts to feel bigger. It feels like it's swelling up. It feels like it's so big, it might crawl through my throat. Like right now, next to you, my heart feels huge, like somebody pumped it full of air. I think this heart swelling is sometimes how God reminds me that God is with me." Ryan replied, "I know what you mean." I'd like to imagine that those disciples around that table with Jesus after he broke the bread with them some 2,000 years ago would would reply, I know what you mean. Because they knew what it was to have God show up. They knew what it was to feel God's absence and then to have Jesus reveal himself among them. They knew what it felt like to have their hearts expanded, transformed even. And they responded with, were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road? While he was opening the scriptures to us? Perhaps Ryan's question still lingers for you. Excuse me, is God coming? Siblings, hear this. Yes, God is coming. In fact, God is already here among us now. Jesus is revealed to us in the most ordinary and mundane places, like on dusty roads and in last-minute dinner conversations. Jesus is revealed to us in each other. Jesus is revealed to us in hopes that never came to fruition. Jesus is revealed to us in hospital rooms, in prison cells, and in the unemployment line. Jesus is revealed to us in our learning together alongside others who are very different from us, in our hard and vulnerable conversations about the realities of racism within our world, our community, and this institution. Jesus is revealed to us in little children's deep theological questions and in the compassionate people that seek to wonder with them. Jesus is revealed to us in the breaking of the bread as we gather around the table for Holy Communion. This is what the resurrection means. God is showing up. God is continually making our hearts burn within us, making our hearts swell bigger and bigger until they might burst out of our chests, reminding us that God is always with us, always being revealed to us in unexpected places. Thanks be to God.
Amen.